Hey guys, welcome back. So we are going to talk about multiculturalism, social justice, and advocacy today. And this is kind of ironic because I just got out of a meeting a little while ago about some new updates that came down that are hot off the press. So I'm gonna try and as competently as I can talk about the current situation of counseling in context of the major changes that are happening in our national politics in America. So I'll try to do my best with that, but I'm also not wildly informed about all the things. So see how I can do. But this is just a hot button topic right now. So I'm going to leave a lot of questions in your head and not make a lot of bold statements. What I want you to be able to do is function in with whatever belief system that you have. We want to bring it into the counseling context. And in other words, try and do our best to equip you to work within the counseling world, but not necessarily to change the way you think. Kind of. I mean, it's important that you learn to think like a counselor, which is maybe different than a non-counselor, but we have a lot of ingrained values, including political values, religious values, and understanding of the way we see the world. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of walk that thin line between helping equip you with the necessary tools to do the work of a counselor, but also let you think like you do and act like you do and within your various belief systems. So that's the task. It's a little tricky, but I think we can do it. So why do we make a big deal about this? What is multiculturalism, social justice, and advocacy? These are big topics, and we'll talk more about advocacy. We probably talked about it last week at this point. But we're going to continue to talk about it because advocacy is the process of putting social justice into action. And it's not just social justice. That's a really loaded term these days. But think about, we want things to be fair for a whole society, or fair or just, right? We want things to function the way they're supposed to function, whatever that might be. We want to have a common understanding. Those are oftentimes like our laws. We want to have a way of living or a way of life that we approve of, right? And it's important that we all have a voice in that. It's kind of our civic duty to have a voice in how the world is supposed to work. So the goal here, even though these are really loaded terms in the context of our culture, which is sort of shifting and changing right now, but advocacy is how do you make your voice known and within the responsibilities or power that you have. The low end is like, what am I basic level responsible for? And the high end is however much power or influence you want to have within that society to change the way it thinks or to have a say in the way people think and act, that kind of thing. Multiculturalism, that part of it is just that people are different and you have to navigate through different kinds of people to have your voice to make things fair and just, right? So that's kind of what those things mean together. I'm going to actually read off the screen here and talk about what that specifically means. What is social justice? Justice? Great start. It's a commitment to promoting access to equity with the aim of empowering and ensuring full participation of all people in a society, especially those who have been marginalized, systematically excluded on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, age, disability status, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or other characteristic of a group membership. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff. So let's just break it down just really quickly. What is commitment to promoting access to equity? That means fairness. That means non-discrimination. The thing that's happening right now in our society is that it seems that in the spirit of equity and social justice, that different groups feel like one of them has more access or is sort of getting advantage more than the other one. And that's really the question. The spirit of social justice is not the loaded term that gets used in the news and all that kind of stuff. It's that how do we make sure there's not all people are empowered, so everybody has the same fair chance to participate. And I'll speak more specifically about what's going on in our culture right now in a little bit. I'm trying to keep this as vague as possible right now, not to avoid the topic, but just to make sure that we're not getting stuck and hung up within the context that we're living right now, and we see the bigger picture. It's the idea. So we want to all have fair and equal access to all kinds of things, including the counseling profession, being counselors, but also the clients that are people that are coming in to see us and being treated by us. This part is a sticky one, especially those who have been marginalized and systematically excluded on the basis of any of those things, those are our federally protected classes, and even things that aren't federally protected. that's what we're going through right now, is figuring out, well, just because you protect people who are, I don't know, just name a bunch of demographics. We'll use African American or Black people who have been historically marginalized in our society because of slavery and all that kind of stuff. Now the movement is, well, what about all those programs that are favoring now African Americans because of that? Some people think, well, absolutely. In order to help one particular race or culture, or any of these protected classes come up to meet all the white people in equity, you have to help them out because they've been disadvantaged for a long time. However, plenty of people are seeing this as like, well, now there's favoritism, and it's harder for certain groups like what is it, Euro? I'm trying to use non-triggering terms here, but like the white people are saying, well, now we're a disadvantage, and so it's this constant battle for what is fairness, right? To me, it feels a little bit like, two children arguing over like who gets the candy. Well, there's only one candy bar and only one kid gets it. And so parents have to say, well, have to hear out arguments for why it's not fair, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to sort out right now together as a country is we know that based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, ability status, all those things, and anything more. Remember, multiculturalism is not just these protected classes that have made it into our legal system. It's all the differences between people. We're trying to say, well, what is fair and what's the right way to live here? And how do we feel like there's fairness even if there's inequality? In other words, well, that's enough said about that probably. But so especially those who have been marginalized and systematically excluded, that's the part that's really in question here of who's been excluded and who's being marginalized. That's what we're trying to sort out, okay? So advocacy is putting all of that stuff into action, doing the work to try and make sure it's fair. That's the idea, okay? So in short, I'm going to move my head here so you can actually see this. If you need to pause it, go ahead and pause it and you can read it. But the idea here is that we're all people with certain human rights, right? Just basic human rights. We have the right to health and the ability to thrive. That is a much more generic and broad definition than the right to access to certain things in American culture. Depending on the culture that you live in, it may not primarily be American. Some of you might be, born in Canada or Mexico or something like that. So what we're talking about legally in ethics class here in America is there are certain American laws, certain American cultural situations, and yet therapeutically, we're trying to expand our understanding outside of that to say, well, how should people be treated equally so that they can heal? In other words, where is a person's sense of belonging that exists everywhere? If somebody feels culturally ostracized, whether they're in America today or America 100 years ago, that's not really what the heart needs in order to feel included and like they belong in something, right? You can't thrive if you're constantly told you're not good enough or you're an outsider or you don't have the same rights or whatever. So there's a distinction between what's legally appropriate and what's therapeutically appropriate. So that's why I'm using these very generic words here. The ability to thrive, the access to health. Those are basic human rights. And the cultural situation is us discussing, maybe we haven't hit that mark. Maybe we haven't hit that mark in a long time. That's a different discussion that I don't want to get too far into today, but that's the context anyway. So we may disagree on our values, but we have the right to access to good health through belongingness and space to live, okay? So that's the conversation that we can have in class when we get there is who's to say whose political and cultural context is correct, but isn't there something more universal, and how do we aspire towards that? Just seeing other people in a certain way that allows them space to do what they need to live their best life. Doesn't mean tolerate other kinds of bad behavior. It means something else. And that's what we can talk about is what does that mean? Even if I have my own ideal of what good living is and what good health is and what people need to get there, you may not have that same one, but we have to have some common context to respect each other's space to be able to thrive in our own unique way. Or at least that's what the American democratic system is set up to do, right? So just a quick little history lesson, not like we need a lot of it, but the American ancestors came over, took the land from the Native Americans so they could have their own way of expressing their own religious freedoms against the monarchy, the autocracy of England, right? So in the process of trying to make space for different belief systems, we took over another one. And so it's this really messy system where we're trying to aspire to, like, let's all get along, and we can't seem to get along. Right? So it's nothing new. I'm not bringing up anything that's newly interesting or unique to the situation right now either. So this term, cultural encapsulation, when we just think of the word encapsulate, the thing that always pops to my mind is that some of you are not old enough to remember this, but I'm now getting to tell these stories of, like, back when I was a child, we used to have these little medicine pills like Tylenol and stuff. They would come in these little plastic capsules, and you could pull them apart and dump out the little white powder inside, and then add it to a spoonful of sugar. And my mom would always add water to it, so it was disgusting. But anyway, those little things, we call them capsules. So the term encapsulate is to, like, how do we take all that white powder or the things that we go through in our life, our experiences, and package them in such a way that creates something cohesive that we can function with, right? So cultural encapsulation is, what are the boundaries of what I understand or how I think the world works? Just think of maybe the first time, I'm speaking to a bunch of graduate students. So the first time you went off to college, you might have gone to a bigger city. You might have met people from a different culture. You probably met people who have different family lives. Your world expanded. And that's kind of one of the points of college, is to say, not how do I go push the limits of my own culture. Some people go and they come back to their homes and find out, like, oh, that world out there is bigger and weirder and scarier. And I just learned more how to be more grounded in my own culture. Other people said, actually, my own culture missed a lot about how to treat people or the experiences that are possible to us or whatever. So the idea is not to change the way you think per se, but mature and grow in your understanding, right? So cultural encapsulation, the idea is that we grow up knowing from one perspective, and that's dependent on the way we're raised, right? Our family. And our training for here in this class is how do we understand our roles as counselors in more mature ways based on the different kind of people that we're going to experience and encounter. Okay, so it's not to specifically say we need to start equalizing the power. Some of you may think that, and it's not to say we need to just stand stronger in our American values. Some of you may think that too, and yet there's a bigger thing that's happening here that we're trying to grab onto, which is how do we see all these differences in people and allow them, based on the values of the profession, allow them the ability to thrive. Okay, that's the big question of what we're trying to do. So what we know is dependent on how we grow. So what we know about our perspective is how we grew up. In other words, if we had access or didn't have access to resources, the cultural knowledge, like the way people taught us about how the world works, and then our experiences of pain and pleasure. I include that one because how our nervous system is shaped based on who we like and what we like is largely determined by our social emotional health growing up. So in other words, if you have a bad experience, at one time I got stung by a bunch of bees when I was a kid, and I went home and I was screaming and crying, and my mom put me in the bathtub with baking soda, another old person thing to do, I think. Maybe that's still a thing. And then she made fish sticks, and it was like, because it was such a big event for me, I've hated fish sticks ever since. I thought they were the most disgusting things. Actually, now I kind of like them because I've maybe corrected some of the trauma in my life or something. I don't know. But like for a long time, that experience of pain shaped the way I understand the world about how terrible fish sticks are, right? So what we know is dependent on how we grow, okay? And then lastly, the more we understand the experiences of others, the less we're restricted by our own perspective. So part of us becoming counselors is learning about other people openly with curiosity, and then making our own decisions of like, is that a good behavior or a bad behavior? Is that something I can accept and tolerate, or is that something that needs to be remediated? Or is that a thing that just makes them unique, that doesn't have anything to do with what's wrong with them per se? It's just a difference, and I can note it without having to be different myself, and that's okay, right? So think of this classic example here behind me. Again, I'm going to get out of the way. A diver asking a fish, do you like living in the ocean? And the fish responds by saying, I don't even know what an ocean is. In other words, I'm so much, my whole world is what I know, the air that I breathe or the water that I breathe, whatever. And that we sometimes don't even recognize that there's a whole sky above us that's different than us. And so it's like doing this kind of exercise is like teaching a fish about air and what it's like to fly through the air and how high the mountains are and that kind of stuff. It's just almost incomprehensible sometimes to think about how different people are and their experiences are. So we get that in principle, and I think that example probably makes sense to most of us. But the question is, what do we do with that then? Who are the other people that we expose ourselves to, or the other ideas that we expose ourselves to, without feeling threatened by them, or without imposing our beliefs on them, and without letting their beliefs be imposed upon us, right? In other words, can we talk to each other to learn about each other without fighting about it? It's kind of the idea. So food for thought. Remember, bring your questions to class too, or some experiences or whatever, because every time I teach this class, I get these responses like, well, it's not ideal because I always feel like people are pushing their values on me, and I wouldn't want to push my values on anybody else. And in teaching classes like this and having conversations with other people, you hear about and see on the news and social media and all that kind of stuff, all the wildest triggering examples of people who are out there being aggressive and just doing rude things in the spirit of their own ideology. And then when I teach class like this and I talk to you guys and I talk to other people outside of this, I hear people who largely don't want to, they want people to get along and they don't want people to fight and they don't want to impose their beliefs on other people. And yet there is a lot of that out there. So the question is, what can you do within your power, your capacity? So anyway, let's keep going on. When we think of multicultural competence, I actually think this is kind of a little bit of an old term. We used to use kind of starting in the 90s. There were, I actually heard the story of how this term started. The term cultural competence. It started in it was the medical community. So doctors were saying that there's a different experience of people from other cultures who come into the ER asking for services, or a family practice asking for medicines that aren't the same as our sort of Western scientific perspective. And they said it's really important that we become competent in what works for other cultures and what doesn't. And by other cultures, I don't just mean, other countries. I mean, if I work in rural America and somebody walks in from urban Chicago and says, I don't trust white people, or I don't trust old people, or whatever, it's just because that doesn't mean we offer only services white people services or old people services, and that's all you're going to get. Seems kind of unfair. We should be able to acclimate to the culture of a patient or client so that we can help them in ways that they think are best based on what we know is best too. It's a two-way street. That's the idea. And that worked for a while. Everybody was trying to learn about all these things and be as competent as they possibly could. And then a new term came along because people were recognizing that we can't really know everything. It's impossible to be competent in everything, but we have to at least be able to try. And trying requires that we be humble enough to recognize that our way is not always the right way for everybody. So there was a humility involved in that kind of perspective. So the term turned from cultural competence to cultural humility. And there's actually more to that term, it's defined and clarified and all that stuff. I'm not going to go into it now. But cultural humility essentially says, maybe I'm not the center of my universe, or the universe. I'm the center of mine, but not the. The ego is not as powerful as it, or it's more powerful in us than it should be. So we need to be able to hear other people and learn from them. So when I look up at this thing above and I say multicultural competence is kind of an old term, we do want to be competent, and yet it's okay. We can forgive ourselves, and it's okay to not know everything. But let's talk at least about what the components are. One of them is self-awareness. Your ability to judge accurately from your viewpoint and your clients. Okay, so it's not even self-awareness doesn't even fully capture the task here. It's, I know what I'm trying to do, and I know my role, I know my job. We're still working on it, so you guys may not feel totally comfortable with that yet, and that's okay. But when you know what your counseling role is and you can say, okay, based on that perspective, what I can professionally provide, I can communicate that back. I'm self-aware of that. And the part that's stated here in the small text, or not the non-bold text, is that we're supposed to be able to judge accurately from our clients. In order to do that, I need to be open and curious and understand them, which means I need to accurately be doing an accurate assessment of their perspective and then discerning enough to attune to what their needs are. So I know my role, I know what my values are and my professional capacities, and then I hear my client, I understand them, and I know them, and I can treat them based on what I'm aware of within myself and in the situation. I know that's a lot to hang on to, but self-awareness is an important component, and then it's also kind of implied up there that other awareness is important too. Remember, we don't have to agree, we don't have to like, we don't have to appreciate, we don't have to love, we don't have to do all those things. There's maybe a higher sense of duty or responsibility from many of us to do things like that, but that's not our professional capacity, okay? So you can treat a person, just like a doctor is a little easier example, but a doctor can give Tylenol to somebody, just even if he doesn't like the way they live their life, right? In theory, that's the same way of how we're supposed to be doing it, although I think the bar is a little higher and a little harder for counselors because of that requirement for things like unconditional positive regard that the heart needs to be told that it matters, it's valued, and it belongs, and we get to project that. It's ideal to be able to do that authentically, to actually care for people, but at the very least, you have to put your professional mask on to say, I'm projecting a false sense of belongingness to another person so that they can get better, even if you have reservations. That's a bare minimum, and it feels dirty even saying that. So, but it is okay for us to be self-aware that, like, I don't know enough about this person, and I feel like I'm judging them unfairly because of it, or something like that. So anyway, knowledge. The willingness to seek knowledge about the experiences of others, probably pretty self-explanatory. If you don't know something, we have a responsibility to figure it out, right? Clients are not always the best resource for the experience of their identity. And what I mean by that is there's kind of two parts to it I'll give you. One of them is that no one person is responsible to teach about their entire culture. So think of somebody, if you walked over to another country, you get dropped off in a plane somewhere in Ghana, and someone said, oh, an American, tell me about your American culture. And you're like, well, I can speak to my perspective, but I don't speak for all Americans, right? Maybe you're a Midwesterner and you're like, I don't know what it's like to live in the Deep South or the Pacific Northwest or something like that. So clients aren't always the spokesperson for their culture either, right? The other part of that has to do with the language here. They're not the best resource for the experience of their own identity. If I were to ask you who exactly you are, and if you took away all the masks of all your defense mechanisms, all those experiences that you had that have been like pain, pleasure experiences that have shaped who you are, and I said, who are you at the root? You would struggle, because we all struggle with that question. Who am I in the eyes of somebody who has unconditional positive regard for us? Well, sometimes I don't think the best of myself, and sometimes others don't think the best of me. So what is it? Is it the marred, beaten, and battered person that we are? So the amalgamation of all of our experiences, which is, by the way, it's not just a picture of abuse. Like, we are beautiful people, and we carry baggage, right? So who are we at the core of our identity? That's a hard question to answer, and even harder for people who are being treated for a mental health condition. Think of the times in your life when you have been just unwell mentally. Are you the most reliable narrator of your own experience? Sometimes we go to counseling to have help reminding us of who we actually are, because we forget. That's okay, right? So that's why we are responsible to come to learn about people and to learn to help people who don't have that same self-knowledge about themselves, or shouldn't ever be in the position to require it. The question is, and this is kind of a reminder, I guess it's not a question, but the reminder is that you don't get to then tell them to find for them. They have to figure it out. That is the process of therapy. People come in and say, I've forgotten who I am, I'm hurting and I'm in pain, and I need a space to figure it out. I don't need you to tell me who I am, right? That's the humility part of this. And the competence is to say, well, here's what I don't know, and here's what I need to know to treat you. That kind of stuff. Sometimes you can ask people, other times you got to figure it out yourself. But default to, I'm going to learn. And if you want to teach me, great. If not, then I'm going to figure it out. That's the idea. Skills. The most important skill here is the comfort of broaching potentially difficult or uncomfortable topics. I've had this conversation over and over and over again when I was a student and as a faculty, and it's going to continue to be talked about because we are, and this is just my humble opinion, we are exceedingly self-congratulatory about how good we are at this and also not that good at it. So what I mean by that, these are kind of conflicting statements, but what I mean by that is that broaching difficult topics is really hard, and sometimes we don't even notice when we're avoiding something that's hard. You know what I mean? So, for example, sometimes you'll run into a person who, like, let me give you a little background on my disability background. So some people with disabilities, they'll tell you, just ask me about my disability. Don't stare at me. Don't pity me. Don't say like, oh, I know, oh, you must have such a hard time. It's not, that's judgmental and just disgusting kind of, right? But some people say, well, just ask me about it. If I look different or act different, it's okay for you to bring it up. Other people will say, just treat me the same as everybody else. Don't ask about my disability. It's but I'm just a human, just like you. So let's talk about that stuff, right? So it gets really confusing. And even in the counseling context, many of us are like, well, do I talk about it? Is it going to help the situation, make it more comfortable? Or is it just going to shine light on something that's already uncomfortable and trigger a person to be further pushed away by me? And so here's the conundrum that we are in. I'm not going to talk about this and train you how to do it right now, but I just want to sort of put the context out there of like, it is a really, really hard thing. And it's a skill to be able to do this with great tact and know when the relationship can sustain different levels of digging. In other words, okay, we have trust. I'm going to push that boundary of trust just a little bit to know a little more about you and make our relationship more intimate. And then we're going to rebuild it based on some repair that we may have to do. And the process of counseling is often like trust can build and expand over time, which means you have more responsibility to care for bigger things and also the opportunity to broach more difficult topics. And that has to be earned progressively as you go. So that doesn't mean just charge right in and say, I'm going to ask all the hard questions. It doesn't mean avoid anything either. And there's a delicate balance between the two. So therapeutic approach. Also focusing on internal dynamics, psychodynamics, CBT, EFT, or emotion-focused therapy versus systemic dynamics, feminist theory, social model, etc., are less useful. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It's a whole jumbled mess of acronyms. So this is a little hard to explain, but do you remember last week when we were talking about the medical model versus the social model? If I say my role is not to understand cultural context, my role is to treat symptomology. If I focus just on my cognitive behavioral or emotion-focused theories and just sort of stay in that clinical role with just ignoring the outside context of a person, I'm going to miss things. I'm going to miss really important things. There is the systems perspective, which says it's not just the individual in your room, but also these cultural, like a family culture and, what interpersonal relationships is a person involved in that are also impacting this. And when we're thinking about multicultural competence, we're thinking about this a little bit bigger, a bigger sphere of influence on a person. And some people say, well, my role is just to treat the symptoms, not the cultural stuff outside, because I don't have any power to do that. And that's missing part of the equation here. Also, some counselors say, well, I'm here to help a person within that larger context, and they miss some of that important symptomology. I know this is really a lot to take in, and it's really hard to do this well. And I think probably, I wouldn't even know how to say this, but I just have a suspicion that even counselors who are licensed and experienced probably have a hard time with this kind of thing, which is taking in all of our duties and our roles within all of the context of our profession, which means treat people medically within their symptomology using the DSM and also paying attention to cultural circumstances. That's a lot to hold on to. And it's only the best of us that are really good at that. And so within context, take that how you will. I got to speed up a little bit because we're already a half hour in, and I'm only. Do you like my little slide counter? I just put that in. Also, I forgot to caption before too, so hoping that's helping some of you as we go through this. Okay, I'm going to change my mind on some of the things I wrote here. This comes out of the last slide, so we're asking about what do we need to be competent about. It says very rarely are people openly discriminatory, and I'm going to change the way I think about that. I actually have seen more and more, especially recently, more and more people being openly discriminatory because we're living in a time where people's what's the right way to say it? Our hackles are up. We're more defensive. There's a lot of more divisiveness and division and all that kind of stuff. People are just fighting, and I'm seeing more of that sort of discriminatory behavior from all over the place. It's not just a political thing, but that's the easiest, kind of the low-hanging fruit to pick on from both sides of political parties, from various ideologies. I'm just seeing more of that. And when we're talking about these things, microaggressions tend to come to be, what's the right word, attributed to the political left and progressive political movements and that kind of stuff, because it was probably developed, I think it was like originated in academia, right? So what are microaggressions? Let's talk about them, and let's talk about how they are applicable to all people, probably. And we'll give it some different language too. So they are small communications, intentional or unintentional, verbal or nonverbal, that communicate hostility, derogatory or negative insults. And that's a pretty good definition. Another way to think about that too is unintentional breaches in trust, or anything that does not promote the life-sustaining capacity of others. That's my term. Those are my words. So if we take that second definition, and it's not just something that originated in the political left, how am I going to say this? I'm fumbling over my words just a little bit because it's not a political thing, in other words. So you have a group of people right now who are saying, well, why are you so bothered by these small things? You should just let it sort of be water off a duck's back. And then another group of people that says, well, yeah, but you shouldn't say it. I shouldn't have to protect myself from dumb things said or bad comments, like divisive and aggressive things, because it's your responsibility not to say them. And both are true. All of us want to build the capacity to withstand hardship. And hardship includes other people who are ignorant and stupid, right? Whoever they may be. And just because we want to build our own capacity doesn't give people permission to be stupid and ignorant, right? So it's kind of a two-way street here. Microaggressions is just referring to, like, what are those little things, whether I'm receiving it poorly or whether you're giving it poorly, those are the things that don't allow us to get along. And so often they're just accidental little intentional acts of hostility. So just to give you some examples, just the other day I was in a meeting and I was talking to somebody, and we were talking about gender, really sensitive topic, and I said, I was in the middle of a sentence and I started to say the words like, well, you identify as a woman. And then I had a moment where I was like, I don't know if they do. I've never asked. I'm just kind of assuming. And I looked at this person and I said, like, do you? I guess I've never really asked. And they were like, yes, I do. Right? So, but even in that little fumbling example of trying to get it right, but also kind of screwing it up and making it really awkward between us, it was this question of like, how could you not know who I am? I don't feel seen. I don't feel heard. And it was unintentional. I'm doing my best to like let them have a voice and tell me who they are. And yet I also run the risk of like alienating someone, saying, I don't really know. I can't really tell who you are. You know what I mean? So these things get really tricky. And the point is that when I said this comment about that people are openly discriminatory, I think people are. And most of this happens in a very unintentional way by good-natured people for the most part. Okay, so forms of prejudice. This list is now too short, but racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, affectional orientation, who you choose to love and desire, spiritual, religious, and all the other ones. I mean, you list off a few more, write them down in class and be like, here's another form of prejudice. I don't like people who eat with their mouth open. That was a big one in my household growing up because my sister hates that noise. Sorry for, and my nieces now hate it too because they learned it from my sister. Uh, and so sorry for anybody who is sensitive to that. Apparently there's a name for it, like something philia or, one of those things. But nevertheless, there are a million things that are prejudicial if we have this very open, expansive definition of anything that does not promote life-sustaining capacity of others. If I'm sitting there chomping away on food just rudely with, smacking, making all these noises, my sister will tell you that it does not promote life-sustaining. It's not life-sustaining for me to have to listen to your really obnoxious noises. You know what I mean? And I'm being a little facetious and a little tongue-in-cheek with this. But if taken in that way, if we say, is this me to correct the way that I eat or you to tolerate a little bit more? It's kind of a two-way street, and we can only figure that out together. That's the point, okay? Let's go through the above with examples. I've kind of already given you some, so we can talk about more of those in class. We'll do that together. Multiple identities and stereotypes. This is one of those things that we do because our brains require that we understand other people and the world around us, and we don't tolerate confusion very well. So we fill in the gaps oftentimes. If there's information that we don't know, we come up with answers for ourselves. So categorizing people into different identities with perceived traits. When you were a baby and you were first identifying shapes, you're like, that is round, and that one is square. That is a triangle. And then someone says, well, what is this object? That's a ball. I know balls. And someone gives you a basketball and a soccer ball, and you're like, ball, ball, ball. And then someone puts a football in front of you that's all this funny egg shape, and you're like, is that a ball? It's not round like the other ones. It doesn't bounce the same as the other ones. What is this thing, As you grow up, you learn that, oh, that does fit in the category with balls, right? And then you go along this through your whole life, and you're trying to learn about not just shapes, but different kinds of people and different cultures and different historical time periods and all this information. And your brain is just categorizing what fits and what doesn't within the schema. It's a cognitive therapy term. Within the schema or this integrated belief system that I have, what fits and what doesn't. So this is just us doing what we're naturally inclined to do, which is categorize things, right? So we're categorizing people into different identities and perceived traits. All along, we're having these nervous system experiences of what's good and what's bad. We have to have that, right? If you're out foraging in the woods for food, you'd be like, punch out a deer, and you're like, I could eat that. That's a good thing to eat. Or let's say for vegetarians, you find a wild carrot. Maybe we'll say that. And that's a good thing to eat. So I categorize or stereotype the good things to eat, but then I see a mushroom and I'm like, ooh, stay away from that one. What if it's a morel? And you're like, nah, I don't do mushrooms because there's some that are dangerous. It's the same thing we do with stereotypes. Be like, yeah, I met one person from this racial group or this ethnic group, one person who is dangerous, therefore all of them are dangerous, which is like an unhelpful stereotype, because if you do that, you're going to miss the mushrooms that are delicious and good to eat, right? Don't think through that one too much about people that are delicious and good to eat. That's just weird, but you know what I mean, right? So it's a normal thing and yet wildly unhelpful, which is why we come to school and we learn about different cultures and we get into counseling. We say, even though you look like the mushroom that's not good to eat, I can still understand that that may not be the real you inside there, right? You're not poisonous. You're not toxic, even though right now you're acting that way, that kind of stuff. Let me help you back to the non-poisonous version of yourself so that you can be in the good to eat category or the stuff that I like. Hopefully that analogy makes sense. A little bit of a stretch, but we must appreciate the complexities of identities. I think that's probably a moot point by now. Probably makes sense, hopefully. We hold many different identities ourselves, and they are complex. And sometimes they overlap and conflict internally inside of us, right? Think of these questions. Am I black enough? If you have, or straight enough, religious enough, all of these things might be questions that you're asking yourself, right? There's so many examples of overlapping identities. And again, this could be a conversation we have about. I'll give you a few examples, then maybe we can do, if I think about it, we'll do an activity in class or something like this. But we have overlapping identities. Here's one. think of the immigrant child, so the child of first generation immigrant parents, and at home we'll just say they're from, like, I don't know, Thailand or something. At home they speak Thai, they eat Thai food, they come over with their own, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Muslim, whatever religious beliefs that come along with them, all that kind of stuff. And then this kid goes to school with a whole bunch of other people, and all they do is watch TikTok all day, and they're just absorbing all this American culture, and they feel kind of stuck between living the values of their family, whom they may love, and then the values of their friends, who they may also love, and sort of navigating both worlds, trying to figure out, well, am I this way or that way? And what does the blend look like? Because I don't have good examples of what that blend is. So, people are, whether they're straight enough, dealing with questions of, like, is my gender identity clear enough? Is my sexual identity clear enough? Based on the way my family talks about sexuality, is sexuality just like straight missionary, or am I allowed to have fetishes? Or how do I satisfy my own sexual urges or curiosities based within the belief system that I have? Is something gay and something straight? Like, all these questions they're hard to figure out questions, right? And they come from this internal conflict of who am I and what am I okay with? And I guess we don't have to talk too much about am I religious enough? But there are probably some of you who are, when you go to church, you're like, oh man, I'm letting too much of the influence of culture or the devil or whatever, however you talk about it, too much of that is happening, so I need to be a little bit more devout. But then you go back into the working world and you're like, but there are some values that just don't fit within my Christian perspective, or something like that. So hopefully this is making a little bit of sense, and what we could do is just think about some of those places in our own lives where we have conflicting identities. I'm not sure exactly who I am because I live in two worlds. So it's a little hard to think about because we don't often think about them. But when you do think about them and then do a little work to say, oh, I know who I am in this space, it's amazing. So I'm trying to think of a good example if I could tell you one, and can't think of one at the moment. But I know there have been times in my life where I've been like, I didn't realize I was struggling with this until I started thinking about it, and that I didn't know who I was in this context. So here's a quote from the book I think is probably a good one. If you pay too much attention to group membership, you may stereotype your client inadvertently. I'll add that. If you focus too narrowly on the individual, you'll overlook the impact of cultural environment. So well said, succinct and well said, probably better than what I've been telling you too. Okay, we have, we have a couple more slides. I gotta hurry up. So conflicts in the field. Let's talk more specifically about what's going on right now. This is where we can stop talking quite as generally and talk a little more specifically. And this is going to be the part where I struggle a little bit more too. Historically, just look at the dates here. We have 2001, 2010, 2011. So this is a little bit old because I've taken these out of the literature. And the literature still has yet to catch up to what's happening currently. But it's historically, there has been... these are all legal cases, and they're sort of around this, like, gender identity, LGBTQ plus, and faith-based communities. There are lots of other places that identities are challenged in our work, but these are the ones that have become popular and litigated. So in Bruff versus North Mississippi Health Services, there was the question of wanting to refer a client who wanted to work on a relationship with a same-sex partner, but the counselor said, well, I'm going to refer out because it's not what I do based on religious grounds. Okay, so there's a difference between saying I'm not feeling really comfortable and competent, and I want to make sure you get the best services you can. So is it okay if we find this other person because they're going to be so good for you and they'll be great and I'll make sure you get services? And if you can't, we can talk about it. I'm just not as good. That's a different thing. Okay. But this is saying no based on my principles and values, okay? Walden versus the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, similar to the above, only she was an EAP counselor, or EAP stands for an Employment Assistance Program. So if you don't know what that is, we can talk about it. I'll let you know in class what that means, but it's just a kind of counseling that you can do. So, and then So the two that are the most famous, the ones that I know the most about, are Walden and Ward. These are the two right in the middle. Ward was an important one because there was a lot of internal discussion. This was like it was still going on through appeals process in like 2016, I think, or something. So I had heard about like the most recent parts of it when I was in school, in doc school. But the student said, I'm in practicum or internship or something, and I'm not going to see a client based on religious grounds, and because they want to talk about LGBTQ plus issues, whatever it was. And the program said, well, that's a competency of the field. You need to be able to work with all these different kinds of people. You can't just say no. So we're going to remove you from the program. She said it was unfair they removed her from the program. They said, well, you can't perform the skills of the job based on, you have to be able to serve all people, right? Or at least put in a good faith effort. You just can't say no just because you don't like who a person is. That's discriminatory, right? So that was the context of that case. And then Keaton versus Augusta State University, very similar to the Ward case. She was only a year in and expressed anti-homosexuality views on the grounds of religious freedom. So this is like, these are people who, if you're worried about yourself of like, what can I say, what can I not say, which we'll talk about in a second. These are people who really took a stand for something. This was the hill that they were willing to die on. And that's why I got to this level. It's a very different thing to say, well, I have these beliefs and I'm kind of ashamed of them, or, you know, they're embarrassing, or I'm scared to bring them out because I don't want to look like that kind of discriminatory person. It's okay to bring things out if you're bringing them up in the light of like, I think I am biased. I think I do have these prejudice thoughts, or I think I am discriminatory to people. I don't want to be, but that's where I'm at right now. That's a whole different thing than saying, you know, I'm just this way, and that's how it is, and you're going to deal with it, right? So it's a tricky thing because it's so sensitive. So now's maybe a good time to say this too. One of the things that I've noticed is that because academia it's typically more politically progressive, left-leaning in America right now, it has a certain flavor of what's acceptable. Specifically talking about there's in American universities, there's more of an appetite for different religious values and to rail on other religions or religion in general. More approval of sexual orientations, that kind of stuff. And it's unlike that outside of the academia. So people that come in that have a certain faith or a certain sexual orientation or something have a tendency to want to hide and restrict expression of that, which is the same thing for people who are out in the world saying, I can't really talk about my sexuality because it's dangerous. It's not a safe place to do it, right? So the idea of safe emotional environments, the question that I have for us here in the school program, also my job to all my colleagues out there, and to our country in general, is how am I contributing to an unsafe environment? Or am I working to make safe spaces for everybody? In other words, if you want to talk about your faith and its impact, you should be able to do that without feeling like you're going to get turned on by other people. And if we're practicing good counselor values, then we shouldn't be looking at other people saying, you're not doing it right, and that's not okay, right? You know, that kind of stuff. And yet that happens so much, so much. So my job here, and again, this is just a recording, hopefully in class we can create spaces where we can talk about not only our own beliefs that we may not appreciate that much, that we say, this is not the person who I want to be, but this is who I am, to bring that out and talk about it. Or I'm scared to say this about myself because of how you all will think about me. That's what we have the opportunity to work on. That's what therapy is. That's how it's supposed to be. To say, I don't want to be scared anymore. I don't want to live in fear, right? I want to live in an environment where people will treat me as if I belong and that kind of stuff. So I'll just stop there. Some of them, let me skip forward and see if, now we'll just leave it here, but I'll say one more thing too. You can't really see it because I don't know why it's hidden behind this thing, but the Supreme Court of the United States, that's SCOTUS, they've made some decisions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mentioned at the very beginning of this, there was some, it was ironic that we're talking about this because I just read a memo from so I just read a memo from the Attorney General Pam Bondi about recommendations for federally funded institutions or programs or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was all these things about how to not be discriminatory against people. I remember in the context of what's happening now politically, it was more specifically targeted towards the programs that are using, in the name of non-discrimination, actually discriminating against people, right? And some of you might be thinking, yeah, but isn't that what this is about, is to like use this as a weapon to discriminate people against non-discrimination? That might be, and that's a conversation that I don't really want to have, or we can have it, I guess, but like I don't know what to do about that quite yet. But that's the context with which we live in right now, right? People are just mad and they're fighting about stuff. And that, what you can't see underneath these little buttons or whatever, is that there are state laws and state rules, and there's a professional context as well, because even counselors are sort of arguing over what the boundaries of counseling is. I'll save some examples for in class. We'll talk about what those are later, but all of these communities are constantly trying to shape, within this environment, how do we maintain who we are, or what I think we're supposed to be. That's what we're all doing. So in light of all these things, I've already said this, but you're not required to change your religious beliefs, political values, or condone any kind of behavior. In other words, you can still know what's right and wrong, but what I am asking you to do, and what we as a faculty and as a profession saying, let's allow ourselves to question all those beliefs. Even though that belief is something that I want to hold, is it in the service of my best interests and the people around me's best interests, right? If I'm wearing my counselor hat, is this going to help me do the best job as a counselor? If I'm wearing my other identity hats, like as part of my family, is this going to work within that family context? And this is an immensely difficult thing to do for some people who are really straddling two different worlds, right? So while you're not required to change it, you may have to make choices about being a participant in one community or not. In other words, you don't have to change all of your values, but if they don't fit with what's required to be a counselor, then you shouldn't become a counselor, right? If something is more important. We've had people leave other programs, this one and other ones. People leave, I don't want to say all the time, but it's not that uncommon. Like every year there are people saying, actually, this is not what I thought it was, and I want to move in a different direction because of what I want to do for what I think is right. That's okay, right? So stay on track a little bit. What we're here to do is promote health and decision making. It's not shared values or condoning behavior, okay? So it can seem like people are trying to instill their values upon us, and I think that does happen, and that's a mistake that sometimes we make as teachers. But what at least I'll speak for myself here, what we're trying to do is to say, I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about what is the best, most healthy outcome for your clients and for yourself too as a counselor. There are certain values that you have to kind of follow along with and ascribe to, and they're listed in your code of ethics. And beyond that, there's a lot more range of what kind of values you can have. Just asking yourself the question, does it promote health and good decision making for you and your clients? That's something to think about. Also, kind of in the same vein, I guess, promoting a person's ability to thrive is not allowing them, is not an allowance of the means they chose to achieve it. In other words, just because people are doing certain things that they believe are right, it doesn't necessarily mean it's what's in their best interest. Just like saying, use my example of my son. He's 7 years old and he comes home and he says, it would be in my best interest for you to give me more money and allow me to eat more candy right now. And I say, well, I don't really think that's the best thing to help you thrive long term, because you're going to get diabetes and waste all your money on dumb things. He doesn't think they're dumb, but they're dumb. Just kidding. He loves claw machines. We go into restaurants and he's like, I want to play the claw machine. And I'm like, do you need another stuffed animal? Assuming that you spend $100 for every one stuffed animal that you get. Just kidding. He's actually a little better than that. But still, you get the idea. What people think is in their best interest to thrive is not always what they should be doing. So the hard question for us is, what does it mean to thrive? What do people need to thrive? And how do we promote that given the context of what they are choosing to do to get there, right? In Another way of saying the same thing is like you allow people the dignity of risk to make mistakes. In other words, they have to be given the opportunity to make their choices, do their actions, and if they're mistakes, then they're responsible for it, not us. And people are another way of saying this kind of similar thing is I think is funny, and I don't know if I like this phrase, but it's a free country and you're free to be wrong, right? So like they come into you for help, and all you can do is say, well, let me listen to you. Let me give you a space where you're free to sort of struggle through how you want to do this. And you may choose to give people some suggestions, but those suggestions can be dangerous a little bit. They come with a little bit of risk. So sure, give people suggestions. Tell people to diet and exercise more. It's great. But is it really helping them get to the place where they're going to embody that kind of stuff in real life? So again, this is really hard, and there's a lot of discussion to be had about it. But our professional requirement here, as it says, is you're required to listen, you're required to seek understanding, and express non-judgment, unconditional positive regard. But you don't have to like a person or their decisions. It's really hard, but that's our job. Our job is to the medicine. Sometimes I like to use the term artificial dose of attachment. We're here to bond with people, to attach to them, because socially and emotionally they weren't able to do that at a different point in their life, and it's causing dysfunction and symptoms. Now that's a little bit reductionistic. It's sort of reducing all dysfunction down to one thing, and that's totally missing a whole bunch of context. So it's not all the problem, but that's a big component of what makes our work is that we give people space to not feel like they're judged, so they don't have those pain experiences, and they can look at things more objectively without their nervous system getting in the way. So it's just one way to phrase it. A few context-dependent things, conflicts in the field. End-of-life decisions are really tricky. Now, after talking about all this stuff, I'm second-guessing. What does this have to do with multiculturalism and equity and all that kind of stuff? I guess these are the bounds of where we struggle with, like, our personal value systems or our belief systems, and the value of human life. So think about like end-of-life decisions, terminal illnesses. Do you allow a person the right to make their own choices about whether they want to live or die? Or do we constantly, assertively, or maybe even aggressively promote life to keep ourselves legally safe? In other words, if someone says, I've been given a month to live, I'm in so much pain, my family is just taxed to the max, because of the work they've been putting in to help keep me healthy and safe, and I just want to be done with this. And you're like, oh, that's a lot of suicide talk, and they're high risk because they really have all the means and plans and whatever. Is it our responsibility to keep them alive, or do they get to make their own autonomous choice? That's a question. Abortions. Client comes in and says they want to have an abortion. What is our role? Do we allow them all the choice to make, or do we say, here's some information about abortions that you should or shouldn't do it or whatever? Do you help them along the process, or do you make it harder for them? Like those are questions we have to ask. Divorces. A divorce is the death of an interpersonal system. So are we the kind of people that say, well, divorce can be good for you, or do we say, no, divorces are terrible. They just kill families and they break people up. It's the death of a relationship. Do we have a role to promote one or the other, or do we just come in and say, it's really your call, but I just want you to be well, right? Whether you're treating two people or one person, all that makes it really complicated, right? So finally, an ethical question, and then I'll leave you with this one. Are we required to take action or advocate sometimes, or can we let our clients be fully responsible for their choices? So what is our role to step in and treat a person? And what is our role, or is our role to step back, give them space and say, the treatment is here. I'm just giving you the room and the space to do it. Not telling you how to live your life, not telling you what healthy looks like. I'm just telling you, you come here and figure it out. So how passive or assertive are we in providing the treatment? And what does that even mean? That's one of the big questions, okay? Where is the line for what we must do legally what we should do ethically or what we ought to morally. There's a line there somewhere, and it's a hard thing to find. I heard a quote. It's not going to be up here because I just heard it the other day. But somebody said, and maybe I'll find it and bring it to class, but somebody said something along the lines of ethics is the line between what we have the right to do and what is right to do. Ethics is the difference between what we have the right to do legally and what is right to do morally. It's an interesting way to phrase it, right? And kind of captures the essence of the conundrum that we're in. So there's another quote. If you like quotes, take that one, I guess. I don't know. Courage is knowing it might hurt and doing it anyway. Stupidity is the same. And that's why life is hard. I love this one because it kind of captures that how many situations we get stuck in life and why life can be so hard, especially when it comes to making good ethical decisions as a person and as a counselor. It's just a hard thing to do. So anyway, thank you. And I'll leave it there and I'll talk to you in class. See ya.